The church bell tolled once, twice, and then fell silent, leaving only the sound of the wind pushing against the thin walls. The pews were filled with people who didn't smile. They watched instead, some with pity, some with envy, others with the sharp curiosity of gossip. At the altar, she stood in a simple white dress, the lace borrowed and the fabric stiff against her skin. Her hands clutched the bouquet so tightly the stems bit into her palms. She was 19, and though she'd been told this was a day for joy, her stomach churned with something colder. He was already there, waiting for her. The man they called the Giant of Red Mesa. 6.5 feet of solid muscle, broad enough to block the light from the window behind him. His hair was dark, his jaw shadowed, his hat tipped low until the preacher's voice called for him to lift it. His eyes, pale, hard, and steady, locked on hers and didn't move. When she reached him, he took her hand in one of his, engulfing it completely. The vows came and went in a haze, her voice trembling while his was deep and unshakable. Then came the moment that would be whispered about in every corner of the county. When the preacher asked if he had words for his bride, the giant cowboy stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. In the next 13 winters, he said, his voice carrying to every ear in the church, "You'll give me 10 sons." The crowd shifted, murmuring under their breath. To some it was a vow of love and legacy, to others, it sounded like a sentence. Her breath caught, and for a heartbeat she forgot to answer. Then she forced a nod, because to refuse in front of them all would be to shame both her family and herself. He didn't smile at her acceptance, nor did he kiss her softly like the romance novels spoke of. Instead, he tipped his hat once to the crowd, as if sealing a bargain. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and the church doors opened to a wind sharp enough to make her shiver. They rode away from town on a single horse, his arm a heavy, solid weight around her as the open plains stretched ahead. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of fire, but the beauty of it felt distant, unreachable. 10 sons, she murmured under her breath, unsure if it was disbelief or a prayer. He heard her anyway. "Strong boys," he said. "Men who'll carry the name Carter long after I'm gone." The ranch appeared after miles of nothing, a massive spread of land ringed by low hills, a big barn that dwarfed the house, and herds grazing in the distance. It was impressive, even beautiful, but it felt more like a fortress than a home. He helped her down, his hand steadying her without gentleness. "This is yours now too," he said, as if ownership was enough to erase the ache in her chest. Inside, the house smelled faintly of leather, tobacco, and the faint trace of a woman's perfume, not hers. She noticed a photograph on the mantel, turned just enough toward the wall that she couldn't see it fully. When she reached for it, his voice came from behind her. "Don't." The word was low, heavy. She let her hand fall. Over supper, he spoke little, but when he did, it was with certainty. The fences would need repairing before winter. The cattle drive in spring would be twice the size this year. And, most of all, there would be no waiting on children. "Every winter counts," he said, like it was a law carved in stone. She nodded, though inside she wondered if he knew how heavy his vow felt on her shoulders. That night, as the wind howled against the shutters, she lay in a bed far too large for her, staring at the dark outline of the man she'd married. His breathing was slow, even, untroubled. Hers was not. Somewhere beyond the walls, a coyote cried, its voice thin and lonely. She knew she'd remember that sound, and the weight of his promise, for the rest of her life. The first winter came fast. Snow fell early, and the wind off the mesa cut through every seam in the house like a knife. She woke before dawn to find frost on the inside of the windows, her breath rising in pale clouds as she lit the stove. The giant cowboy, her husband, Eli Carter, was already gone most mornings, tending to the cattle before the sun could rise. He returned covered in ice, his beard crusted white, his eyes sharp as ever. At first, she tried to fill the silence between them with words, asking about his day, the ranch, his plans for spring. But his answers were short, often just a nod or a single sentence, as if speaking was something to be rationed like winter grain. She soon learned he listened more than he spoke, and what he didn't say carried as much weight as what he did. It wasn't long before she noticed the pressure behind his vow. On their wedding night, it had been clear enough, he intended to start a family immediately, but it was in the small ways he reminded her that his promise was no passing fancy. At the supper table, he'd talk of the Carter name as if it were a bloodline as old as the mountains. When she walked the ranch with him, he'd point out the land, the herds, the barns, and say, one day, all this will be theirs. Always theirs, never hers. But there were moments, rare and fleeting, when she caught glimpses of a man who wasn't made entirely of iron. Once, after a long day repairing a fence in the biting cold, he came inside, set his hat on the table, and poured 2 mugs of coffee without a word. They sat at the fire, steam rising between them, and for a moment his gaze softened. "My pa had 8 sons," he said quietly. "We buried 3 before they were grown." She didn't know whether to answer or reach for his hand, but before she could, he stood and went to the window, the softness gone. It was during the storm of January that she began to understand the full measure of the man she'd married. The wind rose to a scream and the snow came sideways, burying the fences and driving the cattle into drifts. Eli was out in it for hours, returning only to grab rope, lanterns, or a rifle. Once, when she begged him not to go back out into the white darkness, he said simply, "The herd is our blood. If they die, we die." And then he was gone again. She waited by the door, the lantern flickering low, her fingers raw from stoking the fire. Hours passed until finally, the shape of a man loomed in the blizzard. He came in half frozen, carrying a calf wrapped in his coat. She took it from him, laying it near the stove, and when she looked up at him, soaked, shivering, snow clinging to every inch of him, she realized that for all his strength, he was still flesh and bone. They didn't speak that night. She simply set a blanket over his shoulders as he sat at the table, and he didn't brush it away. In that silence, something shifted. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was no longer just cold. As the weeks passed, she grew into her place on the ranch. She learned to patch fences, mend saddles, and calm skittish horses. Eli watched her work without praise, but without criticism either. The townsfolk began to talk, not about the strange vow anymore, but about how the young bride of the giant cowboy worked alongside him like she'd been born to it. But as the snow began to melt and the first thaw set in, she couldn't ignore the quiet pressure building again. Each time she felt the weight of his gaze linger, each time he mentioned the coming spring, she knew the vow of 10 sons was still there between them, heavy and unyielding. And though she still didn't understand why 13 winters mattered so much, she felt in her bones that the answer would not be a gentle one. Spring came in slow, muddy steps. The snow retreated from the hills, leaving the ground soft and dark. Streams swelled with meltwater, and the air, though warmer, carried the scent of damp earth and something restless. With the thaw came work, calves to be branded, fields to be mended, herds to be moved to richer pasture. Eli was out from sunup to sundown, and she was often beside him, learning to rope and ride without hesitation. But the change in season didn't bring lightness between them. If anything, there was a new urgency in him. One evening, after supper, he unrolled a map on the kitchen table, his large hands holding it flat. "This ranch," he said, tapping the wide sweep of land marked in ink, "isn't as secure as it looks. Men have been circling for years, waiting for a Carter to grow weak." She frowned. Weak? How? He looked at her then, not with anger, but with something closer to sorrow. "No sons, no heirs, no one to hold it after me." It was then she understood. His vow at the altar hadn't been born from pride alone, it was fear. Fear that the Carter name would vanish, that all the land, the cattle, the sweat of generations would be carved up by strangers the moment he was gone. 13 winters wasn't a poetic number, it was the measure of the time he believed he had left. "My pa died at 52, he said quietly. His pa before him at the same age. 13 winters, maybe less, and the name dies unless, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. The revelation didn't make the weight any less, but it gave it shape. She saw him differently now, not as an unyielding force, but as a man racing against a clock only he could hear. Still, the pressure was relentless. That spring, he began building a second house on the property. When she asked why, he only said, "For the boys. They'll need their own place when they're grown." The certainty in his voice made her chest ache. Yet the ranch had its dangers beyond the ticking of years. One afternoon, while Eli was away driving cattle, she spotted a pair of riders on the ridge, watching the house. Strangers. They didn't come down, but they didn't leave quickly either. That night, when she told Eli, his jaw tightened. "They're from the McCall gang. They've wanted this land since before I was born." It was the first time she saw him load his rifle without a word. As summer stretched on, the tension didn't break. The McCalls kept to the hills, never approaching openly, but always there, like wolves at the edge of a campfire. Eli grew more protective, rarely letting her ride out alone, and when he did, he made her carry a revolver. Not for the snakes, he said when she protested, for the men. Then, in late August, it happened. A dust storm rolled in sudden and thick, turning day to dusk. She was in the barn, latching windows, when she heard the sound of horses, too many, too close. The door swung open and Eli staggered in, dust-coated, blood on his sleeve. They tried to take the herd, he said, his voice hoarse. Shot one of the hands. I drove them off, but they'll be back. She cleaned the wound in silence, her hands steady though her heart pounded. In that moment, she understood that his vow had never been about just children, it was about survival. 10 sons weren't just heirs, they were a shield, an army to stand against the kind of men who would take everything if given the chance. When autumn came and the air turned sharp again, she found herself standing on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the wide sweep of land. Eli joined her, his hand resting heavy and warm on her shoulder. For the first time since their wedding, she leaned into him without thinking. 13 winters, she murmured. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. We'll make them count. And though she still didn't know what the years ahead would bring, storms, enemies, or the weight of the vow, she knew one thing with certainty. She was no longer just a bride in his shadow. She was part of the fight. And in the vast, wild silence of the West, that was worth more than gold. The first frost of the second winter came early, creeping across the grass like silver fire in the moonlight. Eli was already awake when she stirred, pulling on his boots with that same deliberate, unhurried strength that made her wonder if there was anything in the world that could shake him. It'll be a hard one, he muttered, glancing at the thin ice on the windowpane. We need to be ready. Readiness, she learned, was not just about the barn being full or the cattle being fat. It meant checking every fence line, every gate, every corner of the land for signs of trouble. And in those weeks, trouble had a habit of leaving tracks. Boot prints where no hand had a right to be. A cut fence with the wire still swinging. A missing steer found days later, butchered and left for scavengers on the north pasture. Eli said little about it, but she saw the way his hand lingered on the rifle leaning by the door. The McCalls were growing bolder. By Christmas, 2 of the ranch hands had quit, saying they wouldn't risk their necks for cattle that were being hunted like game. Eli didn't beg them to stay, that wasn't his way, but she could see the tension coil tighter in him each day. The vow of 10 sons hung heavier than ever. To him, it wasn't just a dream now. It was necessity. One night, after a long day hauling hay before a blizzard rolled in, he came in later than usual, his face red from the wind. She poured him coffee, and he sat without a word. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "My mother had me when she was 17. She buried my father when I was 12. There wasn't a day after that someone didn't try to take this place from her. I swore it'd be different for my wife. For my sons." She stared into the steam of her own cup, unsure how to answer. The part of her that had once bristled at his vow was quiet now, replaced by something more complicated. He wasn't asking, he was warning her about a fight that had already started. And whether she liked it or not, she was standing in the middle of it. By late January, the fight came to their doorstep. She woke to the smell of smoke, thick and sharp. Eli was already out of bed, grabbing his rifle. From the porch, they saw it. The old hay shed at the edge of the south field was burning, flames leaping into the frozen air. "Stay here," he ordered, but she was already pulling on her coat. Together they ran, boots crunching over frost, the light of the fire turning the snow to blood orange. They managed to keep it from spreading, but the shed was lost. The next day, they found hoofprints leading from the burned ruins straight toward the hills. No attempt to hide them. A message, plain as daylight. That spring, Eli's guard never lowered. He worked longer, rode farther, spoke less. She tried to keep the home warm and the food on the table, but even inside the house, she felt the war outside pressing closer. And still, he spoke of the future, not in soft hopes, but in iron plans. By the 5th winter, he said one evening, we'll have at least half of them. By the 10th, the boys will be old enough to ride with me. By the 13th, his voice trailed off, but she knew what he meant. By the 13th, they'd be ready to stand without him. In quiet moments, she caught herself wondering what their sons might look like, tall and broad like him, or with her dark eyes and quicker hands. It was a thought she hadn't let herself entertain before, but now it slipped in uninvited, like sunlight through a crack in the shutters. When summer came again, The hills greened and the herds fattened. But the peace was fragile. The macaws had gone quiet, which was worse than their noise. Eli called it, the still before the storm. And in the stillness, she realized something she'd never said aloud, the vow wasn't his alone anymore. It was hers, too.